Good afternoon and welcome to Re-engage in Trade, the US presidential election and its implications on trade policy. My name is Stella Sheehan and I am the Deputy Director here at the World Trade Center St. Louis. I want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon. We've presented a number of these events in the Re-engage in Trade series since May, and it will come as no surprise to learn that this one in particular has generated quite a bit of interest. So thank you for joining us. So we're looking forward to a very lively conversation. We have some excellent panelists lined up for you this afternoon. So grab a cup of coffee or some lunch and strap yourself in. Just a few housekeeping rules before we begin. You will be muted for the duration of the presentation. However, if you wish to ask questions, please do so via the Q&A feature at the bottom of the page. And we will do our best to address as many of those as possible at the end of the formal discussion. With that, it is my great pleasure now to introduce our Executive Director, Mr. Tim Nowak. Tim has led the World Trade Center since 2007, bringing years of international business experience in Europe, Asia Pacific, the Middle East, South America, and Africa, where he actually lived for a year. He is a lifelong St. Louisan, a tireless champion for the region, and a 2014 Eisenhower Fellow. Over to you, Tim.
Stella, thank you so much. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to, on a personal level, looking forward to this conversation. We have three terrific panelists that have joined us. And as Stella said, what we're going to do is some brief introductions, and I'm going to ask each one of these panelists individually to make some opening comments, opening remarks, and then I'm going to fade into the background, and we're going to bring Stella back up and our three panelists, and we're going to have a really good, robust conversation of where we are and where we are headed. So with that, I will introduce our first speaker, Jordan Bernstein. Jordan is the Chief Operating Officer of Cassidy and Associates, one of the leading bipartisan government relations firms based in Washington, D.C. As the COO, Jordan manages the day-to-day operations of the firm while also representing his clients, who are as diverse as global brand names to national nonprofits, large health systems, universities, trade associations, and economic development agencies. Prior to his work at Cassidy, Jordan served as Chief of Staff to Congresswoman Joanne Emerson, and in this role, he had unique access to the legislative process and policy work in many different areas. Jordan provides trusted advice and counsel to as many clients as their general representative in Washington, D.C. He earned a bachelor's degree in political science from Michigan State University and an MA in political management from George Washington University. Jordan?
Tim, thank you. Stella, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to join you all today. As you can see, my picture it's like a dating website. It's about 15 years old and I have less hair and it's all gray. But besides that, thanks for having me guys today. As Tim said, I serve as the Chief Operating Officer and a partner at Cassidy and Associates. We are one of the oldest lobbying government relations firms in Washington. I have been there for about 16 years. In that time, my work spreads across a myriad of sectors, including healthcare, agriculture, tech, mining and manufacturing, and consumer goods. So I do a little bit of everything. So on trade, obviously, you know, those sectors, trade is a constant for each of them. In addition, I do, in candor, I do work for the World Trade Center and the St. Louis Partnership as well. So we all are level set. You know, a lot of my work is focused in Missouri and Southern Illinois. So a lot of background and a lot of my last 25 years has been spent in that space. You know, quick overview, we're in interesting times. You know, it's, I think we get lost in Washington, Robert and I are based here, of what the rest of the country sees and hears and is concerned about. I don't know, it's every minute of every day in our lives here, and hopefully it's not elsewhere, but change and transition happens. I think the overarching theme and we'll get into a little more details in some of these things in the coming hour, but I think the overarching theme is from the Biden administration is we're back. You know, America's back in the global space. You know, we are going to be reintroduced, I think, relatively quickly, starting January 20th on Inauguration Day, and getting back into world organizations like the Paris Accords and on climate, and the World Health Organization, being more active in the WTO. I think global engagement is going to be paramount to President-elect Biden kind of re-engaging us as a world leader in a way that's been traditionally done. I think one of the most fascinating things that we'll talk about today will be message versus messenger. How different will President-elect Biden's trade policies be versus President Trump's? A lot of it's similar, but it's just the way it's messaged. And so we'll get into a little more of the difference between message and messenger, and President-elect Biden's Buy American views, and it's not all that differently, and how we handle Europe and the EU and China, and get into deeper conversation. So I'll leave it at that and turn it back to Tim.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jordan, and really appreciate you being with us here today. Next up is Kenny Hulshof. Kenny is Vice Chairman of Kitbon Strategies, a business development and consulting firm based in Missouri and Washington, D.C. Prior to joining KBS, Kenny served with distinction in the U.S. House of Representatives for 12 years, representing Missouri's 9th Congressional District. Kenny served on the Powerful Ways and Means Committee, and he co-authored the Ticket to Work and Work Incentives Act. He was also a key player during the consideration and passage of significant tax legislation in 1997, 2001, and 2003. Prior to his congressional career, Kenny served as a special prosecutor in the office of the Missouri Attorney General. Kenny, thanks for being with us here today.
Thank you very much, Tim. Good to be with you all. For the record, I think I probably also have a more current picture, but when I saw Jordan's picture, I thought I would give you an older version. But it's great to be with you, and I'm not sure about you, but I yearn for the days when we would all gather at the ballroom at the Ritz for actual lunch and having a chance to network. And so hopefully those days are around the corner in the not too distant future. Great to be with you, and especially appreciate the great interest, especially as we see this transition, which will occur eventually. We're not exactly sure when formally, but obviously formally would be on Inauguration Day. You know, in the past, I've been asked from time to time, how would you describe yourself as far as policy? Who is it that you most align with? That is someone that's been on the world stage. And I often describe myself as a Jack Kemp Republican. Certainly on domestic policy, economic policy, I tend to be a supply sider. On domestic social issues like former Congressman Kemp, community-based solutions where government is sometimes a partner, and certainly on the international stage, a free trader. Well, I'm not sure what I am now, given the change in the vernacular. Oftentimes, I hear now, some late night or some of the cable show network hosts who spit out the word globalist and internationalist, and as it's being denunciated. And I think that's one of the legacies that we will be left with after President Trump leaves office. Obviously, it's been an interesting 4 years as far as internationalism generally, but trade specifically. President Trump came in and he told us he was going to do this leading up to the 2016 elections, as far as using tariffs as a leverage, and not just in the economic sense, but using trade policy as a leverage on to affect policy goals like immigration Obviously we recall using trade with Mexico as a leverage in an effort to get policy changed as far as the flow of immigrants into the United States. And I think even the Republican Party now, the legacy of that is you see a lot more folks who are more nationalistic in their point of view. And so it's going to be interesting, I think, then as we transition to President-elect Biden, his new administration. We're going to get into this in some great detail later, but the hand that he's being dealt, I mean, essentially where he's walking into the Oval Office as it relates to current situation internationally, how he addresses those things. One of the things, again, we've seen from President Trump is the unilateral nature, not just of the U.S. going it alone, but the unilateral nature of the president, the chief executive, making many of these decisions. And so I think, that there's been a reset, if you will, as far as the power of the administration. And secondly, a reset as it relates to some of these strategic trade relationships. I'm sure we'll get into the China issue maybe in some great detail, but certainly pleased to be with you. And Tim, thank you for the invitation to join you in this stellar panel, including Jordan and Robert.
Thanks, Kenny, and rest assured, we will get into the China issue. I am sure of that. All right, that's terrific. And our last panelist, last but certainly not least, is Robert Shapiro. Robert is a partner with Thompson, Coburn. He counsels clients in all aspects of international transactions with a focus on the trade and shipment of goods. He regularly presents clients before Customs and Border Protection, the U.S. Department of Commerce, the International Trade Commission, Department of State, and the United States Congress. Robert chairs the firm's international trade practice, and he has extensive experience in advising clients on issues concerning valuation, classification, and origin of imported merchandise, free trade agreements, and export controls. Robert has been incredibly helpful in our work. He has presented at WTC programs in the past. He's probably a familiar face to many of you, and he has counseled a number of our member companies on trade matters. So Robert, thank you for being with us here today as well.
Thanks, Tim. It's quite an honor to be on this panel. Often say, as a partner in a St. Louis-based firm, I kind of feel like an honorary St. Louian sometimes. I'm out in, before COVID, I would be in St. Louis at least once a month for a few days. Also counsel to the St. Louis Trade Compliance Practitioners Roundtable, which is the people who actually are doing some of the trade compliance work for many of the major companies in the St. Louis area. So it's one of my honors to actually work with that group all the time. I will start off by, I'm the lucky one to be the last of the three to be introduced, so I get to kind of start off by taking some at least some comments on, I was going to say some jabs, but some comments on Jordan and Kenny's comments. First, in terms of introduction, trade is my thing. I grew up as a customs broker and freight forwarder. I'd like to say I was a customs broker before I decided to do something legal. My father and sister, who are both customs brokers, both my sisters and my grandfather indeed was a customs broker. They actually don't think that's that funny, but they aren't here, and so they can't reprimand me on that. A couple things to set up what we're going to talk about. I agree with Jordan. We got to separate the message from the messenger. But I will say that to me, one of the things that has happened with the Trump administration is the whole message has changed. And I think Jordan and Kenny both hinted at that, where we're talking about where are we as, I'm inherently a free trader, but that's changed also, this internationalist, globalist, that term, which are bad words in some ways right now, as suggested. So I think that's changed. So I think the whole dialogue has changed. I think we have also the role of China, which has been mentioned, is going to be the big thing. I think for a while in trade, it's China, 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 and I think when we look at other aspects of trade, it will actually, in many ways, relate back to China. I also think we're also looking at an era of managed trade, which is different than free trade. And I think that's one of the ways that the dialogue has changed. And lastly, I think trade as leverage, as Kenny had mentioned, I think the Trump administration has expanded that concept, and I think we're going to continue to see that expand now. That box, I think, different advocates had tried to pry open that box to be able to leverage trade for labor, environmental, and other issues. And I think this administration has perhaps taken the lid off of any separation of trade for other policies. So while we've pulled back, we've also opened up the possibility of trade being used in a wider concept of international regulation in general. So with that, I think I turn it over to Stella.
Thank you, Robert. And thanks to all of you for those introductions. So let's get right to it. So the obvious question, of course, is what are the implications of the election on trade policy from your perspective? So just to kind of set the scene for us, Jordan, I'm going to throw that one over to you.
Thanks, Stella. I mean, look, like I talked about, global re-engagement, I think, is going to be an absolute priority for President-elect Biden. There's no doubt about it. But under that there's a big piece. There's lots of different angles, right? Back to, if I'm President-elect Biden, either at my inaugural speech or the next day I sign to get back into the Paris Accords, for the climate accords, right? That's the first thing I do, and that is, again, the re-engagement. I think, it's then next is the World Health Organization, right? That's day one as well with COVID and saying this is a global problem. We're global leader. We're coming back. You look at what happened with the EU commissioner today. The president of the EU Commission came out and said today is the time for a reset for the US and EU. I think she said it in the last couple hours, right? And so I think folks around the world are excited about the opportunity. But I also think we have to tamp expectations of timing. This is not, global engagement is going to be a priority for President-elect Biden, but trade is not going to be the top of the beginning of his agenda, right? We've got COVID, we've got stimulus we need to have, we got economic issues, which could roll into, and I think Robert will talk a little bit about this, could roll into some of those pieces, but there are a lot of a lot of things that are going to happen before the administration really gets in the weeds on trade policy. But we'll set the stage for the other two. But the EU and China, right? In the last couple of days, China has signed a deal with the ASEAN. 10 or 13 ASEAN countries. Doesn't do much, but it's China coming out there, kind of positioning themselves to take over as the world leader. And so I think this is where President-elect Biden is going to have to engage us slowly but steady. Kenny or Robert?
Great, thanks. Congressman, over to you.
Well, I think, first of all, we're going to see a more traditional approach, for a president or for an administration that often uses the stock market as a barometer of how well the economy is doing. The president has also used trade deficits as a benchmark for whether we're winning the war on trade or losing. And again, there are many reasons why each of those principles is not correct, not economically correct. And so then, as you see the president and Mr. Lighthizer and Peter Navarro sort of exit stage left, or maybe exit stage right, I probably should say exit hard right. You're going to see this more traditional approach. And also earlier, you may have seen, I think it was this week, where Senator Jim Risch, who is the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, they issued a report. I'm not sure the report has actually been made public yet, but essentially there is a yearning, I think, among a bipartisan yearning on Capitol Hill of a more traditional approach, a multifaceted, perhaps nuanced approach. And Robert, I like, for instance, your comment about a managed trade. Because I'll confess, as a freshman lawmaker on Ways and Means, I'm dating myself a bit, but I voted for most favored nation for China, and of course, thinking that, as I think a lot of policymakers did back in the 90s, that China was going to follow the rules, and the WTO was going to be the sheriff in town, if you will, and yet those assumptions were incorrect, at least mine. And so I think we have a new paradigm here, which is going to present some unique challenges to this incoming administration. But I think we'll certainly have more of a bipartisan group behind him to support this multifaceted approach.
Thank you. And Robert.
Yeah, I think it's easier to put tariffs on some goods than it is to take them off, as we've seen from any trade agreement. And in fact, we have a 25% tariff on trucks being imported into the U.S. that is in place because of a trade war with the EU in the 70s, and that those tariffs are still in place. It was a trade war called the Chicken Wars, actually, but had to do with tariffs on poultry. So it's going to be harder to take tariffs off, but at the same time, I think, at least with our allies, the Biden administration is going to probably consider how to do that, with particularly with steel and aluminum, because that was those were hard issues for our allies to swallow. We also have the dispute with the EU regarding Airbus and Boeing. That's going to be other rounds of tariffs to remove, or if we can, or to figure out how that is. So I think managed trade is part of that. But as Jordan said, this is not the first order of business. I think there is a first order of business that is related to re-engaging internationally. But I think the domestic economy, stimulus and COVID are the first order of business. And I think the trade issues and the international issues are going to be to the degree that they connect to that. One of the things in preparing for this discussion today, we were talking about the steel tariffs, and I can imagine a situation where a strong stimulus bill is put in, requiring American steel for bridges and all the infrastructure. And at the same time, then being able to trade off some reduction or perhaps a quota system or some other system to allow our allies, particularly Germany, Europe, to be able to sell steel and aluminum into the US. It's not going to those infrastructure projects. And the idea that we fill up our capacity on the infrastructure and our domestic goals and begin to loosen up some of the restrictions on our allies in order to build on that international peace. So I can see how those things will play together, but I think the first part is really the domestic policy issue is going to come first before.
And Stella, let me just add too, and we can talk a little more in detail on this. My clients in the tech sector are frightened about this digital tax that's starting in France and spreading all over the world. That is the next Airbus, Boeing issue, right? That is, they are losing sleep over this, of how this is implemented and what it means, and how we change our tax code with these multinationals and its implications. It is something that they are having a really difficult time getting their hands around. And we can only tax so much of Kenny's champagne before it's a challenge. And so, we can talk more about that, but that is, I hear that, and I'm sure Robert and Kenny do too, over and over again, of that's the next frontier of trade wars.
Yeah.
All right. So, and you alluded to this actually, Jordan, earlier when you mentioned the Buy American campaign. But Congressman, I want to turn to you for what remains the same at this juncture, and perhaps more importantly, what shouldn't be undone in your view. What do we need to retain going into this new administration?
Well, obviously, as we've alluded to, President-elect Biden walks into office with these multifaceted tariffs, steel and aluminum on almost all trading partners, 3/4 of what we buy from China. And yes, Jordan, wine and cheese, from some of the European countries. I'll acknowledge that. I'll concede your point. And so, as Robert pointed out, though, President-elect Biden has been very cautious so far about these tariffs, and certainly they're going to take a hard look at them. Keep in mind, here's a wild card, by the way, though. The control of the Senate is still not for certain. The January runoff in Georgia, both Senate seats, I can envision if, for instance, Democrats win both of those seats and it's a 50-50 split, and then suddenly you've got, maybe Sherrod Brown of Ohio, who's a chairman of a particular committee. The progressive wing of the Democratic Party is going to be emboldened, I think. And so they may have some impact on at least this discussion of trade and tariffs. You also asked, though, Stella, about what is going to stay. I was involved. Our firm represented the government of Mexico in the previous Mexican administration on the rewrite of USMCA, and boy, that was kind of a roller coaster ride because here again we are combating a Republican president and trying to make sure he didn't blow up NAFTA, but then what takes its place? And some of those provisions in USMCA, I think that's going to be a template for future trade agreements, particularly as it relates to those labor provisions. I mean, one reason why you saw 400 and something House members voting yes, the highest number that I can recall in modern history for any sort of a trade agreement, is because that expansion and that focus on labor and putting those things, into a trade agreement as a template. The last point I would make that I hope will go away is, Section 232, as far as national security interests. Let me state for the record, look, I'm out of politics. I'll never be on a ballot again, except maybe school board. But the government of Mexico and Canada are not national security risks to the United States. And yet this use of 232 in a slap hazard way, I hope, again, that's something that does go away. That obviously there are protections for American commercial interests, and so these protections are appropriate. It's how they are used that may be inappropriate, and so I think that may be something we will most definitely see will be no more overuse, I think, of whether 301, but particularly 232 is going to be used by the incoming Biden administration.
Robert, do you agree?
God, I hope so. I mean, I just think the problem, my real problem with the use of the 232 the way it was is it is what it does to the rule of law in the world trading system. That the U.S. was instrumental in founding. Now, the WTO has some issues and needs to be fixed, and they're going to be difficult to fix. But to use 232 in that way is it just goes to, in some ways, the heart of the rule of law that we have in the world trading system, and I think it was corrosive. One of the things I think that won't go away are the China tariffs, or they aren't going to go away anytime soon. I think that will be one of those managed trade areas. I think one of the the things that this is more practical as opposed to policy, but one of the things that's become very difficult to deal with on the China tariffs is this exclusion process, and most of these exclusions will expire at the end of the year. I can imagine that becomes a little bit more regularized. There's no, right now, no process to request new exclusions or to extend them. I can see that becoming more regularized in terms of managing trade, and also in terms of negotiations with China anyway. In some ways, I think the Trump administration is leaving the Biden administration while a bit of chaos in the trade front. Also, a lot of chits that it's going to be able to trade away to get some changes to the trading system. But the big change is this whole mindset. It's not free trade anymore. I think it is managed trade. I think it's not a free trade. It is, what is the correct level of tariffs to impose, and how we deal with those things. And this, just an aside, it really deals with, in some ways, I'm thinking of the digital technology tax, but we're one of the only major countries without a VAT, and you wonder how that really does play out in world trade, and how that helps or hurts us. And it's been something that we don't talk about as a country, because it would be new taxes or something like that. But it is something I think is worth at some point a discussion, probably not early on.
That's certainly something, as a European, that's certainly something we talk about in Europe, I can tell you.
Right.
VAT. Jordan, same question to you.
Yeah.
Just on the broader level, what do you think shouldn't go away? What do you think will remain?
Look, I think, in a bigger picture, I think that, the country has to start looking at what should we be doing here and what shouldn't we be doing here, right? I mean, aluminum is a great example in Missouri, right? Noranda, I worked in Southeast Missouri. Kenny, spends a lot of time in Southeast Missouri. We New Madrid had the Noranda plant forever. It was a big employer. It's a big deal. The tariffs were structured to help bring in the next generation of aluminum, manufacturing and production in Southeast Missouri. And sometimes things just don't work out. It just financially, it doesn't work. And I think, the unwinding of that. And I also think, this is a little bit off topic, but I also think we underestimated the intelligence of the EU and China in their retaliatory tariffs. Or at least I did. I mean, when you look at, because I had clients that were impacted, when you look at how they imposed tariffs, they went state by state based on the congressional leadership. It was amazing to me. And Robert has been much deeper in this, and McKinney has fought to add tariffs and take off tariffs in his political career. But, they would target Paul Ryan cranberries in Wisconsin because of Paul Ryan. They would go after bourbon in Kentucky because of Mitch McConnell. And it was a really, you looked at these things, you're like, it was a map of the congressional leadership. It was astonishing. And, but that, it just all ravels together of the undoing, to Robert's point, is tough. It is, it was his opening salvo, right? It's easier to add than subtract. And, there's a lot of moving pieces with each one of these things in all these regions. And look, I think they've got to solve the European problem first, because I don't think we can solve China until we solve Europe, because we need Europe to solve China.
Right.
And I see there was a question about, the Asian countries that, I peeked at the chat, and the ASEAN countries. And I think, look, if I'm the US incoming administration, I see China making deals. It was one thing when they started investing in Africa 15, 20 years ago, and nobody else did. And they started putting this investment in some of these places. And they were the first ones to really and now all of a sudden, South Korea is our friend. Australia is our friend, right? These ASEAN countries have been our allies. And I think, a lot of them, we've let others over the last 4 years open the door to, don't put all your eggs in one basket. And so I think, without the specificity, it's just, this stuff is so intertwined. It's going to be hard to, to unravel this thing back to slow. got to go slow and figure it out. So a little bit of indirect dodging of your question, but I think it all kind of relates.
Can I
No,
jump in,
that's great.
Stella, real quick?
Of course, yes.
You know, I wasn't a huge fan of TPP, but at the same time, I think it was the biggest mistake not to pull. It was the biggest mistake was to pull out of it. The whole idea, you wouldn't have had this this new agreement if TPP and the U.S. was part of it. TPP, the whole idea was really to build that coalition primarily to go after China and to make those corrections. And you know, I think we sometimes make the mistake of thinking of trade as bilateral instead of multilateral. So you put tariffs on goods from China. It's not necessarily bringing those goods to the production activity to the US. It may move it to Vietnam. And so now we'll do a 301 investigation against Vietnam. We're going to be playing whack-a-mole under this. The reason we have the World Trade Organization, and again, I think it needs to be fixed and strengthened, but the reason we have that is so that you aren't doing that game. And indeed, for my clients, I saw that directly. It was, oh wait, we're going to shift this from China to Mexico or to Vietnam or to pick your country and bring it in and do that analysis, and it's coming from there. And in fact, you couldn't bring those raw materials into the U.S. because you would pay if they came from China anyway. You would pay the tariffs on the China raw materials. So you might as well take those raw materials, ship them to Vietnam, and make the next item or the finished good in Vietnam and bring it in. It's cheaper than bringing in those raw materials to the U.S. and doing the production here. So this bilateral thinking, which is I felt we were sometimes stuck in, except for the 232, which was really multilateral. But the bilateral thinking, you know, it's not really helping U.S. jobs that way, and that's why we haven't seen that much decrease in the trade deficit.
So, Robert, I'm going to stay with you, just getting down to the nuts and bolts here a bit. And we've had a request for clarification on 232 and 301. And so if you can incorporate that, that would be helpful as well. So if I'm a small exporter here in St. Louis, you know, this is all well and good. You guys are in DC, you're dealing with all of this at the federal level. You know, how does all of this affect me in terms of tariffs, compliance? What are the changes going to be to my supply chain? Can you shed any light on that for us?
So yeah, it's the great lawyerly answer, right? Is it depends.
I knew you were going to say that.
You know, one of the things that we're seeing on the export side is, you know, the more technology is going to be more and more controlled, and that's again a play with China primarily. But you got to deal with that piece of it if we're dealing with any technology. The other one is these trade wars, whether it's the 232, which is a duty imposed on goods because of the threat or perceived threat to national security that that foreign production creates. So that's the steel and aluminum. Or the 301, which is a duty imposed on goods that are imported in the U.S. unfairly, or where they haven't followed WTO rules. What happens, we impose these duties and a country will retaliate and impose duties on those goods. And that's what we saw a lot in the ag sector for China, for example. As Jordan was mentioning, the Chinese were very precise on where they were going and how they were imposing tariffs in retaliation, whether it was cranberries or ginger or lobster or soybeans. You know, they were, or bourbon, and they were for the Europeans. And so these trade wars tend to make the U.S. less competitive in certain other markets. There's a trade-off here of what we're trying to do. And that's the hard part in trade in general, is that trade-off. If you open up your borders in exchange for someone else opening their borders, there's a trade-off. One industry may be hurt and another industry gains. And politically, and Kenny, you probably know this better, you can speak to this better than I can, but the person who's hurt is much more vocal than the people who gain. And in trade, the people who gain are really dispersed. It's the consumers in general, and the people who are hurt are these employees in this industry. So they're much more vocal than the beneficiaries, and so it's a very difficult political balance.
Great, thank you. Congressman, back to you. Same question.
Well, I'll pick up the thread that Robert had as far as certain interest groups, and one of those that's near and dear to my heart, as Jordan alluded to, we have a 1,000 acre corn, wheat, soybean farm about 2 hours south of St. Louis, just south of Cape Girardeau. It's the family farm where I grew up. I own it and operate it today. And, you know, to have these retaliatory tariffs, you know, price of soybeans plummeted. And you talk about affecting your bottom line when you know, there's once our crop is planted and you can't do anything to enhance other than good husbandry practices to, you know, get the best harvest that you can. But what's completely out of your control is the market price. And, you know, we're already dealing with weather events and what have you. And so now suddenly when you've got the chief executive that decides to take on a trade war or start a trade war and the country retaliates, I mean, it's tough. And, you know, and then politically, you know, one of the things is, you know, that I've marveled at is, you know, how the farm community has continued to support President Trump. Part of that, though, was he went to Congress, or he actually got Secretary Perdue to give money out, you know, as far as
a lot of money. You're right.
It wasn't that much money, Jordan. I'm just
it's only $20 billion. It's fine. It's budget dust these days.
It's all relative.
You're right. It's a new world.
I would have much rather have seen those proceeds come from the market as I'm marketing my crop. But you know, and that's again, it creates these imbalances that, you know, because there are, and you're right, Robert. It's the sectors that are being slammed that are the ones that are the most vocal. We saw that through the automobile industry, you know, as this whole rewrite of NAFTA. So again, I think you perhaps will get to turn the clock back a little bit to a more multinational engagement. I will say this, though, you know, as it relates to China. You know, a decade and a half ago, if the U.S. had sounded some alarms about China as far as intellectual property and theft and, you know, what have you, put aside the human rights issues for a moment, but just the economic issues, you know, we had some buy-in. I seem to recall, Robert, you much more steeped in this over the course of time. We would have had some buy-in, I think, from our allies, European allies or others. Now, though, I think, you know, where we are today, I mean, the most recent dust up, for instance, between China and Australia, you know, suddenly my bold prediction, which isn't so bold, is that if the Biden administration begins to engage other nations to ally with the United States as we do this sort of multinational approach to dealing with China, you know, Australia is going to be the first one at the table, as are other nations that have had similar spats with or intellectual property issues or others with China. And so, you know, while the president, I think, has reset this whole issue with this very aggressive approach, as Robert said, I think now then the incoming administration will have some chits to play, whether it's tariffs or other things that will ultimately inure to the United States' best economic interest.
But I mean, let me just add to that, Kenny, a little bit, Stella, off a little bit non sequitur, but back to USMCA, Kenny. I mean, you know, right, NAFTA 93 passed 234 to 200 and 61 to 38 in the Senate. USMCA passed 385 to 41 and 89 to 10. And when you look at the no votes, and we've only touched on this, the no votes almost exclusively in the Senate, 9 out of the 10 were because of climate change, because it didn't address climate change. And of the 41, I'm guessing most probably were in that same boat, right? To your point, we lost the labor, non-labor. We lost, it wasn't about, it's still, the sectors were covered, if it was ag or autos or whatever, taken care of. But, I think, climate and how, again, a little non sequitur here, but how climate discussions and climate policy weaves its way into the future. And if we do any trade deals the next 4 years and anything he does to unravel these things, the president-elect is going to use climate policy, which, look, in Europe, they're all aligned. They'd be all aligned with us, right? We're a million years behind them. I'm not advocating one side or the other on climate change, but obviously the non-industrialized nations are in a different place, and so it's just going to be. I mean, you could call bilateral, multilateral. The way I looked at it, it was micro, macro, which is the same thing. But the president was looking at everything through a micro lens that wasn't about trade; it was about something else. And unfortunately, trade is a macro. You can't, every piece you move has 8 other pieces of impacts. Back to your, Kenny and Robert's conversation about Australia and others. And it's just this ultimate chess game that everyone's playing at the same time. And we all think nobody else is playing it as well as we do, or they all think that. And it's just, it's complicated.
So staying, you've teed up my next question, actually, both Kenny and Jordan. What does all of this mean for U.S. global engagement? And I know we've mentioned China as well, but we can revisit that. But both institutionally and with other nation states, what does this mean for global engagement, Jordan?
Like I've said, I think it's important. Like, I mean, I'm of the Kenny likes to say, I like to say I'm a Kenny Hulshof Republican. Right. So the
ultimate compliment.
Yeah, I love Kenny's the greatest. It's a world economy. It's a global economy. There's very few companies in industries that are just insular anymore. And either where you get your component parts or where you're sending stuff to. And so if we don't get back into, here's one thing. I think we've now seen, we've had the impression, because we're Americans, that we are the leader in everything, and that's why America's great, right? I'm saying this. America's great because we're the best at everything, and the world wants to emulate us. And I think what you've seen over the last 4 years is when you put the anchor in, the world, everybody passes you by. And I think we're at an interesting, point in time where without re-engaging in its entirety, our economy is not going to re-peak. And look, some of this is going to be, again, back to President-elect Biden, back to message and messenger, right? President-elect Biden wants to bring industries back to the U.S., just like President Trump has done and has talked about. It's no different, right? We'd rather have the businesses here if they can be successful, right? And have employees and pay taxes and all these things that makes the system work. But you can't do it alone. And so it's again, I think that is going to be one of the first things that this administration does. I mean, I've said it a few times. So
great, Robert. Anything to add there?
No, but I want to make one comment back to the USMCA piece. So, and that is I think part of the vote is because of what you laid out, Jordan. But I think the other one was when Trump tried to put tariffs on Mexico out of concerns for immigration. It blew up big, and I think that message really rang very clearly on the Hill that you don't get rid of NAFTA, and they were left with no choice but to go with USMCA. And so, and no one wanted to be on that side, or very few wanted to be on that side of, oh, we don't want that, after how much the hue and cry was when they tried to put 5% tariff on goods from Mexico. So I mean, I think that played a piece of it. I do think that the post negotiations, the post international negotiations that occurred on the Hill, that shifted some of the labor stuff and put the labor value content into some of the automobile stuff, did some of those pieces, really helped push that the rest of the way through. And I think, as I said earlier on, I think that opens up trade agreements, as you were saying, Jordan, to climate change issues and other issues in a way that was resistant before. And I think that resistance is going to be gone mostly, and we'll see those things that, trade law is the only law internationally that's got real teeth and enforceability. And so you find that it's going to become the hook for these other things.
Congressman, we do need to get to some questions, but just any thoughts on your end on that before we delve into some Q&A here?
Let's go to the Q&A.
Let's go to Q&A. All right, very good. Let's see what we got here. Do you think the price of re-engaging with our global partners in Europe will be re-entering the Paris Accord?
Yes. Well, no. I mean, well, we're going to anyway. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I mean,
it's not a price.
Look, I mean, I say this, and Kenny will laugh. My old boss was the original climate denier in the late '90s. She was it was a different era, different time. She was an official delegate from the U.S. on agriculture. There was Joe Nolenberg, who went from Michigan, former congressman for the auto industry. But it's come a long way, right? And these discussions and where businesses are, and I think we're going to anyway. We're one of 2 or 3 countries that aren't part of it. I mean, and it's not a great crop. But I think even if we hadn't signed it, if we don't sign it, the EU is still going to want to engage with us, because back to my point about the EU Commission president this morning in Europe talking about it, the reset. It's important for them. It's important for us. We've got to de-escalate. These are allies. I mean, they just are. It's not that, like, I understand there's always going to be the Airbus and Boeing fights or whatever, the next version of that. But, it's much easier to deal with the French digital tax when you're talking with Macron, who sees you as an ally and a friend, than an adversary and an antagonizer.
Absolutely. Anyone else? Any comments to make on that one?
I think steel and aluminum become part of that price. Okay, I think steel and aluminum really do. Figuring out how they're going to deal with, and that's really domestic politics, right? It's Pennsylvania, it's Ohio, it's Michigan, and so figuring out how to deal with that domestic piece is going to be key to that. But I do think from an international perspective, with our allies, that's a price.
Okay, Kenny, anything to add there?
I think that's good.
All right, great. On to the next one. So we have a question from Bella here. How will I, as a small intellectual property company, be affected? My clients are startups and small business.
Robert, you want to take that digital tax?
Yes, Robert, maybe we'll pass that one to you.
It's interesting in that. I mean, I think it depends. It's going to be the second time I use it, at least. Intellectual property is interesting because I think it depends on what that intellectual property is about. I think we're going to see, as I said before, a lot of more restrictions on sharing certain intellectual property, certain patents and information with regard to technology that is going to be used in communications and in data security and military applications. So I think that's one piece of that, is the controls on intellectual property that way. I do think that, and of course the fight with China is about the intellectual property. The digital tax thing's a little bit different because it's really dealing with the use of internet technology and where data is housed and how it's used, and most clients in the information space are, the data they collect is as valuable as anything else that they're doing, and so we're behind the ball on some of that too. It's not the same thing, but data privacy, I think, will be one of the other big things we're going to have to deal with. And California is pushing on that, and Europe's pushing on that.
And Congress it's going to be a huge priority for the Congress next year as well. The Congress committee.
Yeah, what I would say, especially to the questioner, there are the domestic issues. Data privacy is front and center. if the startup is actually looking internationally. We've already discussed, I think, with the European Union, the French and others as far as taxation. But then the larger issue on China, and here, the three huge challenges, I think, for the incoming Biden administration, obviously the trade issue, we vetted that, human rights, which will, not for today's discussion, but this whole IP and technology. My daughter, who's a senior in high school, was elated when I told her that, TikTok is now going to be okay, and
hold on, Senator Hawley's not done yet.
Well, that's true. But Huawei, keep in mind that was a bipartisan, there was some strong bipartisan, congressional bipartisan push. And so again, this is, boy, it's a thicket. It's a thicket to have to try to get through. But I think taking the longer view, which probably doesn't help, the startup questioner, but the longer view as far as China on that issue is, again, there are many other nations that are, that are the same situation as the United States on this. Now, how do you bring China to institute any sort of reforms as far as, a disconnect between a company and its, its trade secrets? Again, those are difficult details to have to resolve ultimately. But the technology issue, and again, the last thing I would say, when Congress passed the Telecom Act in 1996, there was no mention of the internet because, Al Gore had, sorry, I couldn't resist. No, but so policymakers, especially on something as cutting edge as like technology, it's Congress is not a nimble entity. It moves with glacial speed. And so, on this data privacy, there's some great discussions and hearings that have gone on about it. And yet ultimately, whatever may come out of Congress is probably already going to be halfway obsolete once it gets to a president. And so again, that's a challenge as it relates to someone who is looking at a startup or even have an existing firm and having these ultimate challenges to deal with. The policy is going to lag behind just because that's the nature of our republic.
All right, thank you. I think we may have time for one more maybe. What is your opinion on where the US stands after the agreement with the Asian countries? And you alluded to this a little bit earlier, but just to expand on that a bit.
Robert, you want to, or Kenny, I've already kind of said my piece on this one. You guys want to
go ahead, Robert?
I just think it will, it raises the bar on trying to get a uniform approach on dealing with China. I don't know how much it raises that bar, but it does raise that bar. There was a provision in USMCA, and I believe it was in TPP too, that a country entering into an agreement with a non-market economy country could be kicked out of the trade agreement. And I believe that was in the TPP as well. And those are, that was really very focused on China. Whether that has any teeth is an interesting question, but I do think it's going to raise the bar on it. The other bar, I think, by the way, just on the China and technology piece, is I have some concern about creating a Betamax in a VHS world in terms of technology. And that becomes an issue also.
You'll get a VHS at some point in where you are, Kenny. I know your Betamax still works in your part of the world.
Well, gentlemen, I think we're at the top of the hour. We could certainly continue this conversation, I feel, for another two hours probably. This has been really interesting. Thank you so much for your viewpoints. Thanks for making time to join us, and to our attendees. Thank you, especially on a Friday before Thanksgiving. We appreciate you taking the time to join us on this. Just a reminder that for other events in this series, you can check those out if you missed any previously. We've been running this since May, this particular Re-engage in Trade series, because it had a kind of a COVID lens to it. If you've missed any of those, you can catch those on our YouTube channel, on the World Trade Center's YouTube channel. They're all up there for you. And then keep an eye out in December. We will have another event in the series, still putting that together, but keep an eye on your inbox, and that will be coming to you. More details will be coming soon. So have a great weekend and happy Thanksgiving, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you all. Be safe.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.